You had breakfast this morning. Maybe it was bacon and eggs, scrambled quickly while you looked at a screen. You scrolled past advertisements that didn't look like advertisements, past news stories that were quietly placed by public relations firms you've never heard of, past political opinions you believe you formulated entirely on your own, but were actually carefully constructed decades before you were even born. You drove past billboards, listened to a podcast funded by a corporation with a quiet agenda, and formed an opinion about a global event based on an underlying feeling you can't quite explain. None of this is an accident. Every single one of these seemingly spontaneous moments in your daily life traces back to a single, forgotten genius of human manipulation. He was a man most people have never heard of, yet he engineered the invisible architecture of your everyday existence. Over a century ago, he realized something profound and deeply unsettling. The most powerful force on earth isn't military power, it isn't vast financial wealth, and it isn't legal authority. The ultimate power is the ability to make millions of people want things they never knew they wanted, believe ideas they were never explicitly asked to believe, and act in ways they genuinely believe were entirely their own choice. His name was Edward Bernays. Born in Vienna in 1891 and dying in Massachusetts in 1995 at the age of 103, he lived through an entire century of human conflict, industrialization, and rapid technological evolution. In that time, he essentially invented the modern psychological world as we navigate it today. He is the reason bacon became the quintessential American breakfast. He is the reason women began smoking cigarettes in public as a symbol of liberation. He is the reason an elected democratic government in Central America was violently overthrown to protect corporate profits. He is the reason modern corporations don't just sell you physical objects anymore, they sell you identity, lifestyle, and a sense of self-worth. And perhaps most chillingly, he didn't operate in the shadows. He wrote it all down openly, proudly, and in plain, analytical language, publishing books that laid out the blueprint for mass persuasion. He called it the engineering of consent. Others would eventually call it something far more ominous, modern propaganda. To understand how one man managed to unlock the code of human behavior, you first have to understand his family, because his bloodline is the fundamental key to his whole worldview. Bernays was born in Vienna to Eli Bernays and Anna Freud Bernays. His mother, Anna, was the sister of Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis. To make the family tree even more tightly woven, Edward's father, Eli, was the brother of Sigmund Freud's wife, Martha. Edward Bernays was doubly related to Sigmund Freud, making him his uncle on both sides of the family. This was not a distant academic relation. The foundational concepts of psychoanalysis, that human beings are driven by hidden, unconscious desires, that rational thought is merely a thin crust over a boiling cauldron of primal urges, and that irrational fears seek to govern human action, were the background noise of young Edward's life. They were discussed over family dinners, detailed in letters sent between Vienna and New York, and debated during holiday gatherings. When Bernays grew up, he didn't go into medicine or psychology. He moved with his family to New York City in 1892, grew up in a comfortable middle-class environment, attended DeWitt Clinton High School, and eventually graduated from Cornell University in 1912 with a degree in agriculture. He had zero interest in farming. What consumed his thoughts, even as a young graduate, was the mechanics of human influence. How do you get large groups of people to do things? How do you shape what they think, how they feel, and what they buy without ever forcing them? After university, Bernays bounced between unremarkable jobs. He worked briefly for a trade journal, spent time at the Manhattan Produce Exchange, and traveled to Paris, reading shipping cables. But late in 1912, he stumbled into a project that changed the course of his life. He became the co-editor of 2 small medical journals, and through this work he was exposed to a controversial French play called Damaged Goods. The play dealt openly with syphilis, a topic so deeply taboo in early 20th century American society that no theater owner dared to stage it. Where others saw a moral scandal, Bernays saw a masterpiece of psychological framing. Instead of promoting the play as controversial entertainment, which would have invited protests and bans, he reframed the entire event as a vital public health mission. He established a committee of respected doctors, religious leaders, and prominent socialites to endorse the play. He made attending the performance feel not like a scandalous night out, but like a civic duty, an act of enlightened, responsible citizenship. The play opened to sold-out crowds. What should have been a public relations disaster became a massive cultural triumph. This was the exact moment Edward Bernays realized a fundamental truth about the human mind. You do not sell people a product. You sell them an elevated version of their own identity. You don't try to change what a thing is. You change what that thing means to the person buying it. That single insight, forged during the promotion of a taboo play about venereal disease, would go on to reshape the politics, culture, and commerce of the entire 20th century. Bernays quickly transitioned into theatrical publicity, managing high-profile artists like the legendary opera singer Enrico Caruso and the revolutionary ballet's Russes. He was remarkably good at creating buzz, But an event was on the horizon that would scale his realization from the theater stage to the global arena, World War I. War proved to be the ultimate testing ground for mass psychological persuasion. In 1917, the United States entered the war, and President Woodrow Wilson established the Committee on Public Information, known as the CPI, or the Creel Commission. The committee faced a daunting task. The American public was deeply isolationist and heavily opposed to sending young men to die in a European war. The CPI had to transform a skeptical, hesitant population into a unified, passionate war machine. Wilson's famous declaration that America was fighting to make the world safe for democracy was not a spontaneous moral rallying cry. It was an engineered product designed to sell a war. And Edward Bernays, at just 26 years old, was one of the key architects working behind the scenes to manufacture that consent. Working alongside publicists like Carl Biawar and journalist Walter Lippmann, Bernays helped launch a systematic campaign using every medium available at the time. They created thousands of posters, drafted syndicated newspaper articles, produced short film reels, and deployed an army of 75,000 volunteer speakers known as the 4-Minute Men. These speakers gave brief, passionate, highly standardized patriotic speeches during 4-minute film reel changes in movie theaters across the nation. The results were staggering. Public opinion shifted dramatically in a matter of months. Skepticism vanished, replaced by an overwhelming wave of patriotic fervor and anti-German hysteria. Young Edward Bernays stood in the center of this storm, observing the sheer power of modern media combined with psychological messaging. When the war ended in 1918, Bernays traveled to Paris as part of the official American delegation for the peace conference. Standing on the streets of Paris, watching crowds cheer for President Wilson as if he were a messianic savior, another revelation hit Bernays. These people had never met Wilson. They knew nothing of his personal character. Their adoration was built entirely on a carefully constructed media image delivered across oceans through the power of the press. Bernays realized that if wartime propaganda could successfully convince millions of rational citizens to sacrifice their lives and money for a national slogan, that exact same machinery could be deployed during times of peace. If you could persuade people to die for a cause, you could easily persuade them to buy a specific brand of soap, adopt a political ideology, or alter their daily habits. Returning to New York in 1919, Bernays set up a private practice alongside Doris Fleischmann, a talented journalist, author, and feminist who would become his wife and brilliant business partner. Fleischmann was an intellectual powerhouse, ghostwriting extensive memos, strategic plans, and book chapters, providing the foundational logic behind their most successful endeavors. Together, they began adapting wartime propaganda strategies to the peacetime commercial market. However, Bernays recognized a critical obstacle. The word propaganda had developed a dark, manipulative connotation during the war. People were becoming wary of it. So Bernays performed one of his most brilliant rebranding acts. He coined a brand new term for his profession: Council on Public Relations. The phrase sounded professional, noble, and transparent. It implied a harmless, two-way dialogue between an organization and the public. But in practice, it meant the exact same thing as wartime propaganda: the systematic scientific manipulation of public behavior for private profit and political control. Bernays didn't rely on gut feelings or creative guesswork. He built his strategies directly on the academic theories of his uncle Sigmund Freud, combined with the social psychology of thinkers like Gustave Le Bon, author of The Crowd, and Wilfred Trotter, who theorized the herd instinct. Le Bon had demonstrated that when individuals become part of a mass group, their capacity for logical reasoning drops drastically, making them deeply vulnerable to emotional suggestion, shared outrage, and symbolic messaging. Trotter showed that humans possess an innate, primal urge to conform to the group, terrified of social isolation. Bernays synthesized these theories into a clear framework. Because human beings are fundamentally irrational creatures driven by unconscious urges, you can never truly convince them using facts, logic, or detailed arguments. If you want to change behavior at scale, you must bypass the conscious mind entirely. You must trigger their unconscious desires, hijack their deep-seated fears, and anchor your product or political cause to their need for status, acceptance, and security. In 1923, Bernays published the first ever book dedicated to the field, titled Crystallizing Public Opinion. In it, he argued that a public relations expert was not a mere press agent or promoter, but an applied social scientist who possessed the keys to the collective psyche. The book established public relations as an essential element of corporate and political power. 5 years later, in 1928, he published his masterwork, boldly titled Propaganda. The opening paragraph of that book remains one of the most stark, unapologetic declarations of elite control ever written. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. Bernays didn't write those words as a warning. He wrote them as a proud manifesto. He argued that true democracy could not function if the masses were left to their own irrational devices. Without an elite group of invisible engineers quietly guiding public thought, directing consumer choices, and organizing collective opinions, society would devolve into chaotic violence and social breakdown. In his view, manufacturing consent was not a betrayal of democracy. It was the very mechanism that allowed democratic societies to stay stable. With his theoretical foundation fully built, Edward Bernays was ready to unleash these psychological mechanisms upon the modern world, transforming everyday citizens into perpetual consumers and turning public opinion into a malleable commodity waiting to be shaped. By the late 1920s, Edward Bernays was no longer just an advisor to theater directors or military committees. He had become the secret weapon of corporate America. He understood that if you want to control what people buy, you never try to sell them on utility, features, or price. You build an environment where purchasing the product feels like an inevitable, logical choice driven by social pressure and scientific consensus. His commercial campaigns were masterclasses in indirect manipulation, operating through trusted proxies, fabricated authority, and psychological triggers that bypass conscious resistance. One of his earliest and most iconic commercial triumphs was for the Beechnut Packing Company, a major producer of packaged bacon. In the early 20th century, the rise of factory jobs and office work had shifted the daily habits of working Americans. The heavy, calorie-dense morning meals of the 19th century agrarian era were rapidly disappearing. Millions of Americans were replacing heavy breakfasts with light, quick alternatives, usually a slice of toast, a glass of juice, and a cup of black coffee. Beechnut's bacon sales were collapsing, and their executives were desperate for a solution. A conventional advertising agency would have spent millions running magazine ads screaming, "Eat Beechnut bacon," or listing the nutritional benefits of pork. Bernays knew that direct commands trigger immediate consumer skepticism. People don't like being told what to buy by someone trying to make a profit. Instead, Bernays looked for an unquestioned source of authority in American life: the medical establishment. He went to his firm's consulting physician and asked a deceptively simple question: is a heavy breakfast more beneficial to the human body than a light one? The physician logically agreed that after a night of fasting, a substantial meal restores energy more effectively than a piece of dry toast. Bernays then asked the doctor to send a letter detailing this opinion to over 5,000 physicians across the United States, asking if they agreed with the principle that a hearty breakfast was healthier for the working public. Over 4,000 doctors signed and returned the agreement. Armed with this overwhelming scientific consensus, Bernays did not run advertisements. He ran news stories. He distributed press releases to hundreds of newspapers with headlines that blared, "Thousands of physicians recommend hearty breakfasts to improve public health." The articles detailed how medical experts unanimously urged the public to eat heavier morning meals to combat fatigue and improve productivity. And what was the classic, quintessential, heartwarming heavy breakfast highlighted throughout the press coverage? Bacon and eggs. Bernays never once mentioned the Beechnut Packing Company in those initial press releases. He didn't have to. By creating a national health narrative endorsed by thousands of medical figures, he reshaped the American morning culture. Bacon sales skyrocketed across the entire industry, and the enduring myth that breakfast is the most important meal of the day became permanently embedded in the collective consciousness, not because of biological necessity, but because Edward Bernays needed to sell pig meat for a corporate client. If the bacon campaign demonstrated how to manipulate authority, his next campaign proved he could dismantle deeply rooted cultural taboos by hijacking human identity. In 1928, George Washington Hill, the aggressive president of the American Tobacco Company, walked into Bernays' office with a massive commercial challenge. The sale of cigarettes to men was approaching saturation, but half the adult population remained almost entirely untapped: women. While some progressive women smoked in private, there was a fierce, long-standing social taboo against women smoking in public. In the early 1900s, women had been arrested, jailed, or publicly humiliated for lighting cigarettes in municipal parks or on city streets. Society viewed female smoking as vulgar, unfeminine, and morally suspect, associating it with prostitution or social delinquency. Hill told Bernays, "If we can break that taboo and get women to smoke on the street, we will instantly double our market. Find a way." Bernays realized this was not a problem that could be solved by highlighting the flavor or quality of Lucky Strike cigarettes. He needed to tap into a deep, unconscious psychological driver. He reached out to Dr. Abraham Brill, one of Sigmund Freud's key disciples practicing in New York, and posed a fundamental question: what does a cigarette symbolize to a woman's unconscious mind? Brill explained that in the psychoanalytic framework, cigarettes were symbols of male dominance, authority, and power. At that exact moment in history, American women had recently won the right to vote and were fighting for broader economic and social equality. Brill suggested that if a woman could be made to associate smoking with her own independence, the cigarette would cease to be a dirty habit and become a physical symbol of female emancipation. Bernays seized on the phrase Brill used to describe this phenomenon: torches of freedom. Bernays carefully planned his counterattack on social norms for Easter Sunday, March 31st, 1929. The annual Easter Sunday parade along Fifth Avenue in New York City was one of the most covered media events in the nation, attended by thousands of well-to-do citizens, photographers, and journalists. Bernays covertly hired a group of young, stylish debutantes and prominent feminists to participate in the parade. His secretary, Bertha Hunt, sent out anonymous telegrams to young women across the city, framing the event as a major civil rights demonstration. On Easter morning, as thousands gathered outside St. Patrick's Cathedral, the hired debutantes stepped into the center of Fifth Avenue, pulled packs of Lucky Strike cigarettes from their purses, and lit them in unison in front of rolling cameras. Bernays had ensured that photographers and newspaper reporters were tipped off in advance that a dramatic feminist protest was about to occur. The reaction was instant and explosive. The following morning, newspapers across the country ran front-page photos of the young women strolling proudly down Fifth Avenue with cigarettes in hand. The New York Times ran the headline, "Group of Girls Puff at Cigarettes as a Gesture of Freedom." Not a single news outlet mentioned Edward Bernays. Not a single article mentioned the American Tobacco Company or Lucky Strike. To the American public, it appeared as a spontaneous, heroic act of modern women shattering an archaic gender taboo. Within months, women lighting cigarettes in public became a symbol of sophistication, independence, and modern feminist identity. Lucky Strike sales exploded, and an entire generation of women became addicted to a toxic product because Bernays had successfully tied tobacco to human liberation. Bernays repeated this invisible playbook across dozens of industries. When Dixie Cup wanted to eliminate reusable glass cups at public drinking fountains, Bernays didn't advertise paper cups. He funded a front group called the Committee for the Study and Promotion of the Sanitary Dispensing of Food and Drink, using manufactured health scares to make shared glassware seem like a deadly vector of disease. When Procter & Gamble wanted to sell ivory soap to children who hated bathing, Bernays organized national soap sculpting competitions in public schools, turning a mundane hygiene product into an artistic medium that millions of children played with for hours. However, as brilliant as these commercial campaigns were, they were merely rehearsals for the darkest and most destructive application of his theories, geopolitical regime change. By the early 1950s, Bernays was working as a high-priced public relations consultant for the United Fruit Company, a massive American corporation that dominated the economy of Central America. In Guatemala, United Fruit was practically a state within a state. It owned over 500,000 acres of land, controlled the nation's only major port, owned every mile of railroad, and commanded the electrical grid. Locals referred to the company as El Pulpo, the octopus, because its influence strangled every aspect of Guatemalan life. In 1951, democratic elections brought Colonel Jacobo Arbenz to power in Guatemala. Arbenz was a moderate nationalist who wanted to modernize his country and lift millions of indigenous peasants out of desperate poverty. In 1952, Arbenz passed Agrarian Reform Law 900, which authorized the government to seize uncultivated land from massive estates and redistribute it to poor farming families. The law specifically targeted uncultivated land. United Fruit, which held hundreds of thousands of acres unused as a land reserve, had 40% of its property expropriated. The Guatemalan government offered to compensate United Fruit based strictly on the land values the company itself had declared on its official tax filings. United Fruit was furious. The compensation offered was a fraction of what the company claimed the land was worth, as they had systematically understated their property values for decades to avoid paying local taxes. More importantly, United Fruit feared that Arbenz's successful land reforms would inspire similar nationalist movements across Latin America, threatening corporate monopolies everywhere. United Fruit turned to Edward Bernays, and Bernays orchestrated a psychological campaign that would destroy a democracy. Bernays knew that American citizens and politicians in the early 1950s did not care about the profit margins of a tropical fruit company. However, he knew precisely what they did care about: the overwhelming, irrational terror of Soviet communism during the height of the Cold War and the Red Scare. Bernays' strategy was brutally clear: reframe a corporate dispute over land reform as a grave national security threat to the United States. He would persuade the American public, the press, and the White House that Jacobo Arbenz was a secret Soviet agent creating a communist beachhead just a short flight from the American border. Bernays created another front organization, the Middle America Information Bureau, which flooded American news outlets with fabricated reports detailing communist infiltration in Central America. He organized secret, lavishly funded press trips to Guatemala for influential journalists from the New York Times, Time, Newsweek, and the Saturday Evening Post. The journalists were shown carefully selected, anti-Arbenz figures and given scripted briefings written by Bernays' team. Upon returning home, these journalists published alarming stories warning that Guatemala was rapidly collapsing into a Soviet satellite state. Bernays sent weekly newsletters to every member of the U.S. Congress, framing Arbenz' moderate democratic reforms as a direct challenge to Western civilization. The psychological trap was set. The manufactured public outrage created the precise political cover required for covert action. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and CIA Director Allen Dulles, both of whom had personal and legal ties to United Fruit, moved swiftly. In June 1954, the CIA executed Operation PB Success. A small, covert mercenary force backed by American air support invaded Guatemala, while CIA-operated radio stations broadcast fake military news, spreading mass panic throughout the capital. Demoralized and convinced that a massive American invasion was underway, the Guatemalan military refused to defend the government. On June 27, 1954, Jacobo Arbenz was forced to resign and flee the country. In his final radio address to his people, Arbenz stated plainly that his government had been overthrown not because it was communist, but because it dared to put the welfare of its impoverished people ahead of the profits of the United Fruit Company. The military dictator installed by the U.S., Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas, immediately repealed the land reforms, returned all property to United Fruit, banned trade unions, and established a brutal authoritarian regime. This coup triggered a catastrophic 36-year civil war in Guatemala, resulting in the genocide, torture, and disappearance of over 200,000 citizens, mostly indigenous Mayans. Edward Bernays had successfully overthrown a democratically elected government without firing a single weapon himself. He had simply manipulated the stories, managed the journalists, and leveraged the Cold War anxieties of the American electorate. He had proven that, with the right psychological triggers, you can make an entire superpower consent to an atrocity, believing all the while that they are defending freedom. The dark geometry of Edward Bernays' achievements raises a chilling question. When you build a machine designed to manipulate human irrationality on a global scale, who ultimately ends up controlling it? Bernays operated under the comfortable delusion that his techniques were neutral scientific instruments, tools that an enlightened elite would always use responsibly to maintain order and progress. History, however, proved far more dangerous than his quiet ivory tower theories anticipated. In 1933, Bernays hosted a dinner party at his home in New York. One of his guests was Karl von Wiegand, a foreign correspondent for the Hearst newspapers who had just returned from Germany. Von Wiegand shared a disturbing detail about Joseph Goebbels, Adolf Hitler's newly appointed Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Goebbels, the architect of the Nazi Party's rise to absolute power, possessed an extensive propaganda library, and among its most prominent, well-thumbed texts was Bernays' 1923 book, Crystallizing Public Opinion. Goebbels was actively using Bernays' theories of group psychology and emotional contagion to engineer the demonization of the Jewish people and pave the way for totalitarian rule. Bernays, himself a Jewish man, was genuinely shocked by the revelation. Yet his documented reaction in his 1965 autobiography was shockingly cold and clinically detached. This shocked me, but I knew any human activity can be used for social purposes or misused for antisocial ones. There was no deep moral reckoning. There was no agonizing over the monstrous consequences of his life's work. Instead, there was only the cold, unyielding stance of a technician pointing out that a knife can be used to carve bread or kill a man. He refused to admit a fundamental truth. When you spend a lifetime convincing the world that the masses are subhuman, irrational cattle waiting to be led by invisible leaders, you create the exact psychological climate where fascism thrives. In the decades following World War II, Bernays continued to write, lecture, and advise political figures and major corporations. In 1955, he published The Engineering of Consent, doubling down on his core belief that democratic choice was an illusion that needed to be managed by experts. But as the late 20th century unfolded, his critics grew louder. Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter famously described Bernays and his peers as professional poisoners of the public mind, exploiters of foolishness, fanaticism, and self-interest. The iconic 2002 BBC documentary series, The Century of the Self, laid bare how Bernays had reduced citizens to perpetual consumers, turning human desire into a mechanism of political control. When Edward Bernays died in 1995 at the age of 103, his methods had become so thoroughly woven into the fabric of daily life that they no longer even had a name. They had simply become the air we breathe. If Bernays were alive today, he would look at our modern digital landscape not with surprise, but with immediate recognition. He would look at your smartphone and see the absolute perfected realization of everything he pioneered in the 1920s. Consider the modern digital architecture surrounding you. The traditional public relations campaign has evolved into algorithmic micro-targeting. In Bernays' era, he had to hire physicians to mail physical letters to 5,000 doctors to construct a health narrative. Today, data brokers collect thousands of personal data points on your location, political leanings, fears, health anxieties, and shopping habits. Algorithms process this behavioral data in real time. delivering personalized content designed not to inform your intellect, but to trigger a specific emotional response, keeping you angry, anxious, or insecure just long enough to click a button or buy a product. When an influencer casually holds a skincare bottle in a video that feels completely spontaneous and raw, that isn't authentic human connection, it is native advertising, the direct descendant of Bernays' Easter Sunday Torches of Freedom parade. When a corporate-funded think tank publishes a study claiming a new drug or policy is beneficial, that is the modern iteration of the beechnut bacon strategy. When synthetic bot networks generate thousands of fake comments on social media to create the illusion that a political candidate or cultural movement has massive popular backing, that is astroturfing, a practice Bernays perfected a century ago. The tools have become exponentially faster, infinitely cheaper, and vastly more precise, but the underlying psychological premise remains completely unchanged. Human beings are irrational creatures driven by unconscious forces, and if you can trigger their identity, fear, and desire for social belonging, you can make them consent to almost anything. This leaves us with the ultimate question: was Bernays right? Is human nature so inherently flawed, chaotic, and driven by base instincts that we must be managed by an invisible elite for our own good? Or is the engineering of consent a poison that slowly destroys human agency, reducing self-governing citizens into passive, easily manipulated consumers? The answer depends on whether you choose to remain asleep within the machine he built. Bernays relied entirely on human ignorance. His entire system of manipulation collapses the moment you see the puppet strings. When you recognize that an ad is not selling you a coat, but selling you a feeling of status. When you realize a political headline is designed not to report facts, but to provoke outrage that drives engagement. When you understand that your deepest desires are often carefully planted long before you act on them, that is the exact moment you reclaim your mind. Understanding the mechanics of mass manipulation is the ultimate act of self-defense in the 21st century. It is the boundary line between being a passive pawn in someone else's strategy and becoming a conscious, independent individual. We are building a community right here for people who refuse to stay blind to these hidden systems. We explore the hidden machinery behind power, psychology, money, and control, the forces that quietly govern your life without your permission. If you are the kind of person who wants to see the world as it actually operates, rather than how it is packaged for mass consumption, then you belong here. Hit subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments below, and take back control of your perspective. I'll see you in the next one.